So in the last topic, we were talking about Genesis and this idea for the Abrahamic religions, which is to say Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. We were talking about this idea that from Genesis, they developed this perception of linear time, right, of things starting at one point and ending at some other point. What I'd like to do now is focus a little bit more tightly on Christianity. Now, we could be doing this with Judaism, we could be doing it with Islam too, but the reason I'm talking about Christianity is that it's the Christian tradition that then later develops into some of the scientific traditions that I want to get into with Aquinas and then Copernicus and Galileo and even Newton. So it seems to me worthwhile to think about time in a focused way on Christianity. And the reading that we did for today was from The City of God by Augustine of Hippo. And it's really tough stuff, right? So don't feel bad if you were slogging through it. Don't feel bad if you fell asleep 3 or 4 times. I do all the time. Not a big deal because it's hard, right? The language is just really hard to get through. But it's worth it if we can do it. So let's sort of back up and put him into context a little bit, and then we'll talk a little bit more about the reading. So Augustine was writing The City of God in about the first 100 years after Christianity really began to figure itself out. And what I mean by this is that Christianity did not have an exact structure for the first 300 or 350 years. And it was only after about 330 or 350 that Christianity started to figure out what it meant, what its ideas were, how its structures worked. And it was a really interesting process because it took 2 ideas and put them together. First, it took the ideas of Plato that we were thinking about and talking about a few topics ago, and it took this idea that there is an absolute and perfect truth outside of us. And then it added to that the Jewish idea of morality and a covenant between humans and God, that humans do moral things because God does moral things. And what happened here then is this idea that if we can try to put the Platonic ideas and the Jewish ideas together, we'll come up finally with what we think of as Christianity. So let me give you an example of how this works. Remember with Plato, he told us that there was this perfect reality out there, that the truth was external to us, that the truth was timeless, right? It was in a place where time did not have any effect. It was inexorable. It was immutable. It was universal. It was outside of us. But what Plato never did was tell us what that truth was, right? He said, go ahead and grasp onto the truth, but he doesn't say exactly what the truth was. Along come the Christians after having experienced Jesus and the stories about Jesus, and they began to say, wait a minute, maybe it was Jesus that Plato was talking about. Maybe it was Jesus that is the exact perfect truth. And this developed through the first 300 years or so of Christianity until finally, shortly before Augustine was writing his City of God, Christianity more or less agreed with the idea that Jesus Christ was completely a human being, they would say completely man, and that he was completely God. Right? This is a paradox. It can't be. You can't have a man who is God. You can't have God who is a man. And they said that is the central issue, the central paradox of Christianity, that Jesus was equally man and equally God. So this is not a theology course, but think of what it means for us when we're thinking about and considering time, right? Because God is outside of time and sees everything that happens outside of time and inside of time. God can create the things inside of time, as we read in Genesis, but the things inside of time are subject to change. The things inside of time don't understand God. So how do you deal with this idea that Jesus Christ could be both God and human, perfect God, perfect human? This was the central paradox that they were wrestling with, and one that even Augustine was thinking about 100 years later. So he's trying to figure this out, and he basically says, look, the Christ event, the life and the death and the resurrection of Christ happened one time, right? You'll remember that from the reading that he said, I think, for once Christ died for our sins, and rising from the dead, he dieth no more. So he says that's a single point in history. And at that point in history, outside of time, God, inside of time, humans were merged into one thing, in this perfect new Adam, this perfect relationship of the created world inside of time and the creator outside of time. He says, that only happens once. We get it once. It doesn't happen again. It can't go around and around and around. It can't go over and over again. So time has to be linear. More importantly, though, in those 30 or so years, Augustine believed, that Christ was on the earth, both time and timelessness were merged into one thing. So the perfection of timelessness and the imperfection of time were all merged into this one being. And that was what was so cool for him about that event in time, because there's a way in which time didn't really work in the same system while Christ was there. But once Christ went up into heaven, for Augustine, then time went back to being linear again. So he says we have this linear system, and we know that it started with Genesis, and then it went from Genesis up to Christ, and then it went after Christ again in a linear way. All of that makes really good sense to him. So he says, good, now we know that time, without question, is linear. We know that we are in time. We know that God is outside of time. But we also know that God can come inside of time with us. And that would be what we might call the Christ event, the thing that happened with Christ. But there are still problems to be worked out. And one of them, for Augustine, was the age of the world. So Augustine believed, as many early Christians did, that the world was roughly 5,000 to 6,000 years old. And he did that by just going through the Bible and adding up everybody's age. And that came to between 5,000 and 6,000 years. This is a very old idea. It makes a lot of sense. You just add it all up. That's how the timeline works. But other people said, no, right? The world can't be 5,000 years old. It can't be 6,000. It's got to be much older than that. And Augustine responded to that in City of God by talking about the idea of the beginning of the world. Let me read the text a little bit, and you can remember it too. He wrote, if it offends them, these are the people he doesn't agree with, that the time has elapsed since the creation of man is so short, and his years so few, according to our authorities, let them take this into consideration, that nothing that has a limit is long, and that all the ages of time, being finite, are very little, or indeed nothing at all, when compared to interminable eternity. So by interminable eternity, he's not talking about class at 8 o'clock in the morning. He's not talking about that. He's talking about true interminable eternity. Something has no end. Something there is no beginning. Something there is no end. In other words, something where time doesn't have meaning. What is that a place? That is outside of time, maybe even heaven. So he says, look, you can say that the world is 6,000 years old. You can say it's 60,000 years old. You can say it's 6 billion years old. And you know what? Doesn't matter at all. Why doesn't it matter? Because if you can count the years, they mean nothing. They mean nothing in comparison to the timelessness of God. So he comes finally to the conclusion that, yes, time works in a line, that yes, there was this incredibly important break when the outside of time, God, came with the inside of time, human beings, that's a very important thing, and it only happened once. But moreover, the whole timeline, while we understand it, and it seems important to us, ultimately is nothing compared to that perfection, that wisdom, that beauty outside of time that is heaven and God.